There you are. Step quietly tonight. It is time for chapter 51. It knew her name. That was the thing she could never get past. Whatever was in that empty ward at 2 in the morning, it knew her name, called it softly, in exactly the tone of someone who needed help. She was a nurse. She had spent her entire career answering exactly that call, and whatever was in that ward knew that about her, knew her name, knew her instincts, and used both to get her to walk to the far end of an empty ward and turn around and see what was in the beds. A nurse was working the overnight shift in a large hospital. She was experienced. Several years on night shifts had given her a thorough familiarity with the particular rhythms of the building after dark. She was making her rounds through the quieter sections of the ward when she heard it. Her name, called softly from within the darkened side ward she was passing, not loudly, not urgently, softly, the way someone might call if they were not sure whether you could hear them but did not want to disturb the patients further down the corridor. She stopped outside the side ward and looked through the glass panel in the door. The ward was dark, empty. No patients assigned to it that night, no staff who should have been inside. She stood outside the door for a moment, then opened it and looked in. The ward was quiet and dark and completely empty. She was about to leave when she heard it again. Her name from further inside. She stepped inside. She told herself afterward that she had done so out of professional habit, that the instinct to check on someone who might need help was simply too deeply trained to be overridden by the reasonable observation that the ward was empty. She moved between the beds slowly. The ward had perhaps 12 beds, all empty, all made up in the standard way of unoccupied hospital beds. The voice did not call again as she moved through the ward. She reached the far end, looked around her. Nothing, nobody. The darkness and the empty beds and the particular smell of a ward that had not been occupied recently. She stood at the far end and felt the particular combination of relief and embarrassment that comes with having followed a sound to its source and found nothing. Then she turned to walk back. If these stories find their way to you, if you feel drawn back to this quiet room again and again, there is a place for you here. Others have found it. Perhaps you will tell them you did too. The beds were occupied, every single one of them. She stood at the far end of the ward and looked down the length of it toward the door. 12 beds, all occupied, figures lying in each one, still, the particular stillness of patients in deep sleep. She stood completely still herself and looked at the occupied beds that had been empty 30 seconds ago when she had walked past them. Her mind offered several explanations rapidly and discarded each one with equal speed. She had not passed anyone. The ward had been empty. The door had not opened. No one had entered behind her. And yet 12 beds that had been empty were now occupied by figures lying in the particular stillness of deep sleep. She looked at them carefully and noticed that not one of them was breathing. She walked back through the ward, quickly but without running. Running felt wrong. Running felt like it would change something about the situation in a way she did not want to change. She walked between the occupied beds with her eyes forward, not looking at the figures in them, not looking at the stillness of chests that should have been rising and falling. She reached the door and pushed through it into the corridor outside. She stood in the lit corridor and breathed, and did not look back through the glass panel in the door. She continued her rounds. She completed her shift. She filed no report about what she had seen in the side ward. There was no category in any hospital reporting system that would have accommodated it. She told me this story some years later, in the careful and measured way of someone who has thought about how to tell it for a long time. She said the thing she thought about most was not the occupied beds, not the stillness of figures that were not breathing. It was the voice that had called her name, the softness of it, the particular quality that had made it sound like someone who needed help. She had been a nurse for many years. She knew what someone who needed help sounded like, and the voice had sounded exactly like that, which meant either that whatever had called her name had genuinely needed something from her, or that it had known exactly how to make her follow it to the far end of an empty ward and turn around and see what was in the beds. She was never entirely sure which of those possibilities disturbed her more. I have spent time in hospitals myself, on both sides of the experience, as someone who cared for others and as someone who was cared for, and I can tell you that certain wards in certain hospitals carry something that does not appear in any medical record. A residue of everyone who has ever lain in those beds through the long hours of the night, hoping, fearing, waiting for morning. Most of the time this residue is simply a feeling, a heaviness in the air, a particular quality of silence, but occasionally, on certain nights, in certain wards where the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever lies beyond it has grown thin, that residue becomes something more present than a feeling, something that knows names and uses them and waits to see who will answer. Another whispered story from Japan, shared quietly here beside the kotatsu. If you work night shifts in hospitals and you hear your name called from an empty ward, keep walking. Whatever is calling you knows your name, but it does not need your help. And yet I find myself returning to something she said. The voice had sounded exactly like someone who needed help, a nurse who spent her career answering exactly that call, and something in that ward knew it, knew her name, knew her instincts, knew precisely what kind of voice would make her stop and open the door and walk to the far end of an empty ward and turn around. That is not random. That is not chance. That is something that had been watching her long enough to know her completely and had been waiting, patiently, for exactly the right moment to use what it knew. If this story stayed with you, if the dark or the shadow feels a little closer tonight, you know where to find me. I am always here, beside the kotatsu, watching, waiting, and if you wish others to find their way here too, I would not object.